When Euphemia Dorcas lunged out of the mist and caught the masked gentleman by the lapels beside the lower pond, she meant only to create a scandal large enough to save her from marriage. Instead, she kissed the very man she had been promised to. The reeds along the water shivered in the late summer dark. Music from the house drifted faintly across the lawns, softened by distance, by lantern smoke, by the sort of glittering masquerade evening her mother adored and Euphemia despised. She had escaped the ballroom 10 minutes earlier, with her pulse hammering and a reckless plan forming itself into shape. If the families wanted a bride of perfect obedience, she would give them disgrace. She had not expected the stranger at the pond to be so still. He wore a dark domino mask and a black coat cut with expensive restraint. He stood with one gloved hand resting on the low stone edge, as if the noise of the fete had driven him out for air just as surely as it had driven her. When he turned at the sound of her steps, the lantern light from the terrace touched the clean line of his jaw and the cool surprise in his posture. She did not let herself think. "Forgive me," Euphemia whispered, though she did not mean forgiveness at all. Then she rose on her toes, caught his coat, and pressed her mouth to his. It was meant to be a weapon, a rumor, a deliberate act of feminine sabotage. But the stranger did not flinch like a fool ambushed by flirtation. He froze first in shock, then steadied with a self-command so powerful that she felt it before she understood it. One of his hands lifted, not to seize her, not to throw her off, but to hold the space between action and restraint. When she broke away, breathless, the silence between them felt far more dangerous than outrage. "You are either very desperate," he said at last, his voice low and level, "or very certain of your methods." "I am both." His head tilted slightly. "Then I fear for the man you mean to destroy." She nearly laughed. "So do I." A burst of laughter rose from the house. Somewhere behind them, a servant crossed the gravel path carrying more candles toward the music room. Euphemia's courage returned all at once, bright and foolish. "Good evening, sir," she said, already stepping back. "Miss—" But she was gone before he could finish. If stories of proud hearts, dangerous misunderstandings, and love that begins in scandal speak to you, like this video and subscribe to Quiet Fires of America. She reached the ballroom flushed with victory. Her cousin Letty caught her wrist at once. "Where have you been? Your mother is furious. The Duke has arrived." Euphemia smiled too quickly. "Then she may have him." Letty stared. "You have done something." "Possibly." "Euphemia." But the first trumpet note cut across the room before further confession could be extracted. Heads turned. The crowd opened in a ripple of bows and jeweled curiosity as the new Duke of St. John entered beside her father. And Euphemia stopped breathing. He was taller without the darkness around him, broader in the shoulders. Mask still in place for the formal reveal, but unmistakable now in the carriage of his body, in the black coat, in the impossible composure of a man who did not need ornament because rank had already done the work. Her father was beaming. Her mother looked as if Providence itself had finally learned to cooperate with her social calendar. The Duke's gaze crossed the room and found Euphemia immediately. Then, with devastating calm, he reached up and removed his mask. Dufton St. John, 5th Duke of St. John, was not handsome in any soft or easy way. He was severe where other men aimed to charm, quietly built, grave-eyed, and so contained that pleasure seemed like a rumor someone else had started about him years ago. But Euphemia knew that mouth now, knew the shape of the voice that had answered her by the pond, knew, with a horror so vivid it almost felt comic, that she had just kissed her intended husband in the dark like a desperate actress in a bad novel. He bowed. "My lady." There was no mockery in it. That made it worse. Her mother glided forward. "Your Grace, may I present my daughter, Miss Euphemia Dorcas." "Miss Dorcas and I," he said, eyes still on hers, "have already had a brief introduction." Only she understood the blade hidden beneath the politeness. Lady Dorcas brightened. "How delightful." Euphemia wanted the pond to open beneath the house and swallow her whole. The match had been discussed for months. Her father's estate, though respectable, had been weakened by 3 poor harvests and a costly legal dispute over boundary rights. The St. John connection promised security, alliance, and rescue from the kind of genteel decline her mother found more shameful than death. Dufton, lately returned from settling the ruinous mismanagement left by his late uncle, needed a wife of solid family and blameless reputation. Euphemia had heard the arrangement described by others so often that it no longer sounded like a future, only a transaction spoken aloud in different rooms. She had decided, privately and furiously, that if she could not refuse the match directly, she could at least make it impossible. Now impossibility was staring at her with unreadable gray eyes. The first dance was unavoidable. When he took her hand for the country dance, Euphemia felt the memory of that reckless kiss burn beneath her skin. She expected him to punish her with wit, with coldness, with some elegantly devastating remark. Instead, he led her into the set with infuriating steadiness. "You chose an unusual tactic," he murmured when the figures brought them near. "I see your Grace recognized me." "It would have been difficult not to." I had hoped for darkness, confusion, and a permanent stain upon my prospects. One brow moved, barely. "You say that as if you regret failing." "I regret succeeding in the wrong direction." For the first time, a flicker of amusement touched his mouth. "Then let us both count the evening educational." His calm infuriated her because it denied her the satisfaction of scandal. She had prepared herself to resist arrogance, not patience. Arrogance could be mocked. Patience made her feel young. "And what have you learned, Your Grace?" "That my future Duchess is willing to commit strategic assault when cornered." "I am not your future anything." "No?" "No." He guided her through the turn, released her, reclaimed her again. "Then I advise you, Miss Dorcas, to tell your family so more effectively than by kissing strangers in shrubbery." The words should have stung. Instead, they landed with humiliating accuracy. She looked away first. The following week, she hated him on principle. It was easier than admitting confusion. Dufton visited Dorcas Hall twice under his mother's formal approval and Lady Dorcas's unbearable delight. He arrived punctually, spoke little, observed everything, and treated Euphemia with a courtesy that felt almost like mercy. He did not mention the pond. He did not threaten to expose her. He did not behave like a man triumphantly aware that his intended bride had made a fool of herself. He asked what books she liked. He noticed that she preferred the old South Terrace because it overlooked the tenant orchards rather than the ornamental lawn. He listened when she spoke about the parish school, the winter coal lists, the apothecary's widow who hid hunger behind good breeding. Men courting approval usually praised her hair or her dancing. Dufton asked how many of her father's cottages still needed roof repair. It was intolerable. Because it was intimate in exactly the way she had not defended against. Her resistance had been built for a man who wanted a decorative wife. Dufton seemed to want comprehension. she mistrusted that more. At St. John House, where she went with her mother and father for a week's stay in early autumn, the scale of the life awaiting her became impossible to ignore. The house sat above the river with old stone dignity and too many windows. The servants moved with well-trained quiet. Portraits of dead St. John's looked down in polished disapproval. The Duchess Dowager, Arabella St. John, received Euphemia with perfect breeding and a gaze so measuring it felt like being assessed for structural integrity. Arabella was not openly cruel. She was far more dangerous than that. She valued composure, hierarchy, and usefulness, and she believed love was an unstable ingredient best excluded from major family decisions. She had chosen Euphemia because the Dorcas name was respectable, the girl was well-born, and the estate alliance made sense. Whether Euphemia herself desired the life was, in Arabella's opinion, a secondary matter. "You will find," the dowager said on the second morning, while inspecting breakfast as if managing troops, "that a great house rewards steadiness over sparkle." Euphemia spread marmalade with deliberate care. "Then I am fortunate to possess neither." Arabella looked up. Across the table, Dufton nearly choked on his coffee. The dowager did not smile. "With is charming in moderation." "Then I shall try to remain below the medical dosage." After breakfast, Dufton found Euphemia alone in the orangery, where she had gone to escape the feeling of being catalogued. "My mother believes she's encouraging you," he said. "She encourages as a general bombards." "I know." She turned toward him. "And does your grace always yield so serenely under artillery?" "Not serenely. Economically." That answer startled a laugh out of her before she could stop it. He looked at her then in a way that made laughter suddenly dangerous. "I do not wish you to feel trapped here," he said. She folded her arms. "Yet here I am." "Yes," he said quietly, "and that is precisely the problem." Something shifted in her chest at that. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of fear in another direction. A man openly indifferent could be resisted. A man who saw the trap and disliked it might be harder to hate. Still, she had reasons for fear far older than Dufton St. John. Euphemia had grown up watching women disappear into marriage, the way small houses vanish inside larger estates, name preserved, identity consumed. Her eldest sister had become wife, mother, hostess, manager, peacemaker, and eventually a pair of tired eyes and an expensive face. Another cousin, married brilliantly, now spent her days pleasing a husband's family that treated gratitude like a permanent debt. Society called these women fortunate. Euphemia thought them annexed. She did not want to become another careful lady at the edge of her own life. And Dufton, for all his patience, was still a duke. His world would always be larger than hers. His name would absorb hers. His land, his responsibilities, his legacy, his tenants, his history, his mother, his household. She feared not violence or vulgarity, but erasure. A soft, respectable, perfectly legal erasure. He began to understand that before she ever said it aloud. Their closeness grew by increments too small for society to measure and too dangerous for Euphemia to ignore. He showed her the estate ledgers because she asked intelligent questions. She surprised him by noticing errors in the tenant dairy accounts. He brought her to the North Fields after rain, where she watched him speak with farmers in plain terms rather than theatrical benevolence. One afternoon, she found him kneeling in shirt sleeves beside a lame stable pup, binding its paw himself because the boy assigned to the kennels had gone white with worry and guilt. "You do not seem especially ducal just now," she said. "Do not tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain." And what reputation is that? That I am cold, difficult, and should never be approached before noon. She smiled despite herself. Only before noon? I improved slightly with weather. She began, against intention, to wait for his voice. That was when Celestine Vale returned to the district. Celestine was the daughter of a viscountess cousin to the St. Johns, beautiful in the polished way society instantly rewards. She had once been widely rumored as Dufton's likely match. Her family possessed connections, her manners were faultless, and her smile managed the rare feat of appearing warm while calculating advantage. She arrived at St. John House in a carriage trimmed with needless elegance and greeted Euphemia as though pity were a form of sisterhood. "My dear Miss Dorcas," she said, hands lightly enclosing Euphemia's fingers, "how brave you are to step into such a household so quickly. Great houses can be rather consuming." Euphemia heard the warning inside the sweetness. Later, she found the sharper version. Celestine joined her in the gallery before supper, studying the ancestral portraits with appreciative detachment. "Dufton has always required careful management," she said. "He dislikes emotional display, but he admires efficiency. One must never make him feel crowded." Euphemia turned. "How useful for me that you have prepared a manual." Celestine's smile deepened. "I only mean that affection is not always the currency by which such marriages prosper." It was precisely the sort of statement that could only wound if it contained some truth. That night, Euphemia danced twice with men she disliked simply to prove she could. Dufton watched without visible objection. That hurt more than jealousy would have. When he finally caught up with her on the west terrace, moonlight silvered the stone balustrade and sharpened the line of his restraint. "You seem determined to quarrel with me this evening," he said. "And you seem determined not to notice." "I notice everything about you." The quiet force of it stopped her. "Then why," she asked, voice suddenly rawer than intended, "do you stand there as if it cost you nothing?" For a moment he did not answer. When he did, the words came from somewhere deeper than social ease. "Because if I step toward you carelessly, Euphemia, I shall not know how to step back." That confession should have satisfied her. Instead, it frightened her more. She had feared being swallowed by rank. Now she feared being wanted by a man who understood the seriousness of wanting. The break came through Arabella. There were household decisions in which Euphemia had begun, naturally and perhaps too visibly, to take interest. School accounts, the linen room, a tenant woman recently widowed, a cook dismissed years ago under dubious accusation, whom Euphemia quietly believed had been wronged. Dufton let her ask questions. Arabella did not appreciate the questions at all. "One does not rewrite a house before entering it," the dowager said in the blue morning room, after Euphemia suggested that Mrs. Finch, the widow of a former steward, be restored to the pension list. "One does not ignore injustice merely because it has become traditional," Euphemia replied. Arabella's expression cooled. "You are not mistress here." "No," Euphemia said, "I have noticed." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut silk. Dufton entered just in time to feel the damage without hearing its opening note. Arabella rose, dismissed the matter as fatigue, and left with perfect dignity. Euphemia remained by the window, furious, ashamed of being furious, and suddenly very young. "She is right," Euphemia said before you could speak. "I am not mistress here. I am only the woman being folded into place. That is not how I see you. Perhaps not, but it is how this house behaves." He came nearer. "Tell me plainly." So she did. She told him she could not bear to become an adornment to a lineage, could not live under perpetual comparison to dead duchesses and flawless hostesses, could not spend her life making herself smaller so the machine of a great house might run without disturbance. She told him that every kindness from him had made matters worse, because kindness tempted hope, and hope was the cruelest snare when freedom had not truly been offered. When she finished, her hands were trembling. Dufton stood very still. Then he said the one wrong thing. "You are imagining a prison before the door has even closed." The pain of it arrived instantly. "Of course I am," she said. "Women are expected to notice doors before men do." She left him there. For 3 days they moved around one another with the politeness of people who had discovered a fault line and did not yet know whether the house would hold. On the 4th, Celestine exploited it. At a musicale crowded with neighbors, she positioned herself beside Arabella, let one confidential laugh carry farther than it should, and remarked, far too audibly, that some women were charmed by ducal attention without understanding the stamina required to sustain it. Euphemia heard. So did half the room. Worse, she saw 2 older ladies exchange the tiny, satisfied look of people watching a girl learn her scale. Public shame, once lit, never stays in one corner. Euphemia did not cry. She refused that victory to them all. She walked out instead, down the side hall, through the orangery doors, and into the cutting garden where dusk and lavender nearly hid the tremor in her breath. Dufton found her there. "She had no right," he said. "Then why does everyone behave as if she did?" "Because they are bored and unkind, and because they believe she understands your world better than I do." He stopped an arm's length away. "Do you believe that?" "I believe she knows how to survive it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Survival is not the life I want to offer you." "Then what life do you want to offer me?" His answer did not come, not because he felt nothing, but because for perhaps the first time in years, feeling outran language. Euphemia mistook the silence. "Exactly," she whispered. She returned to Dorcas Hall the next morning under the excuse of her sister's confinement. The excuse was real enough. The retreat was more real. Absence changed the shape of truth. At home, she discovered 2 things quickly. The first was that she missed Dufton with humiliating force. The second was that distance made her clearer-eyed about the dangers surrounding the match. Her mother, alarmed by whispers that the engagement had cooled, redoubled pressure. Letters arrived with advice disguised as tenderness. A family friend suggested that once wed, affection often followed duty if one simply committed to the role. Euphemia, reading this, wanted to set the page on fire. Then Mrs. Finch came to see her. The widow had once overseen household stores at St. John House before being dismissed 7 years earlier after a jewelry inventory discrepancy that had quietly ruined her reputation. Euphemia had written to her out of instinct after the argument with Arabella. Now the older woman arrived with a worn reticule and the manner of someone long trained to endure disbelief. She brought more than memory. She brought a copy of an old household notation and the name of the true thief. A former companion to Arabella's late sister, long protected for reasons of family embarrassment. Mrs. Finch had taken the fall because the scandal of prosecuting a gentlewoman would have stained the house. Arabella had preserved the family name by sacrificing a dependent woman's livelihood. The revelation did not make Arabella monstrous in the simplest sense. It made her worse. Socially intelligent enough to call harm necessity. Euphemia stared at the paper until the ink blurred. Now she understood the deepest shape of what frightened her. Not merely that she might disappear into a great house, but that in such houses, injustice could be renamed duty, and everyone expected to thank the architecture for standing. She rode to St. John House the next day without waiting for permission. Rain had passed in the dawn. The gravel still held dark patches of wet. Dufton was in the East Court, speaking with a steward when she arrived, mud on her hem and fury holding her upright. He dismissed the man at once. Euphemia. No, listen first. He listened. She showed him the paper, told him about Mrs. Finch, told him what it meant, told him that if he expected her to enter his life while his mother's version of order remained unquestioned, then he was asking not for partnership, but surrender with prettier furniture. He read the notation twice. All color left his face. My God, he said quietly. Yes, Euphemia answered. That is roughly my view. He did not defend Arabella. That mattered. Instead, he asked for time enough to verify the record and confront the truth properly. Euphemia, still shaking, nearly refused. Then she saw that he was not protecting comfort. He was assembling justice. There was iron in that difference. The confrontation with Arabella took place that evening in the family library, beneath portraits of long-dead men who had probably called similar sacrifices prudence. Euphemia was present because she insisted. Arabella received the accusation with cold disbelief, then cold anger, then something more dangerous, fatigue. Yes, she said at last, after the documentation and dates made denial ridiculous. Mrs. Finch was innocent, but the alternative was scandal that would have touched your aunt's daughters, your uncle's negotiations, the entire house. One life was spared greater ruin by allowing a smaller one to bend. Euphemia felt sick. Dufton did not raise his voice. He never needed to. It was not yours to spend, he said. Arabella looked at him as if he had crossed some ancient invisible line. Everything here has always been mine to preserve. No, he answered. Only mine to inherit, and ours, if I am worthy of asking it, to make honest. The words landed in the room like a judgment. Euphemia watched something pass between mother and son then. Years of discipline, expectation, mutual respect, and unspoken injury. Arabella had taught him strength by teaching control. She had also taught him the cost of valuing structure above people. For the first time, he refused that lesson in front of her. He restored Mrs. Finch's pension the next morning. He sent private letters to the families who had helped circulate the old stain upon her name. He told the truth where truth could still repair anything. Then, before the house had finished absorbing the shock, he asked Euphemia to walk with him to the lower pond. The same pond. Mist again lay over the water, thinner now in the colder season. Reeds bent in the wind. Euphemia stopped at the stone edge and folded her arms, because if she had not, she might have reached for him too soon. I brought you here, he said, because this is where you first tried to frighten me away. I am glad to know I failed memorably. You succeeded memorably, not in the way you intended. She looked at the water. I did not know what happens now. I do. When she turned, he was nearer than before, but still giving her the dignity of choice. I cannot promise you a life untouched by duty, he said. I cannot make this house small enough that its history will not matter. I cannot change what my name carries. But I can say this plainly. I do not want you absorbed. I want you beside me, arguing with me, correcting me, enlarging the life I thought was sufficient when it was only orderly. Her throat tightened. I have been cautious all my life, he continued. Too cautious to call certain things by their proper names until they were nearly lost. You were right about that. You were right about the door. You were right that women are asked to walk into rooms men have never had to fear. He drew one breath, as if even now honesty required force. So I will not ask you for obedience. I ask you for partnership, for the right to build something with you that does not consume you, for the chance to be loved by a woman who once kissed me out of pure strategic rebellion. She laughed then, helplessly, softly, through the tears she had sworn not to shed. That is a very peculiar declaration, Your Grace. I know. It is also the truest one I possess. And if your mother hates me forever, she does not hate you now. She fears what you change. That is not exactly soothing. It comforts me greatly. He rarely smiled fully. When he did, the world around him seemed to lose some unnecessary severity. Euphemia stepped closer. Do you know, she said, that I once meant to ruin this engagement because I could not bear the thought of becoming your duchess? I know. And now? He waited. She touched the front of his coat, right where she had clutched it that first night in the dark. Now I think I could bear being your duchess, if I may remain entirely myself while doing it. His answer was not immediate speech, but relief so visible it nearly undid her. Then remain. All of you. He kissed her then without masks, without ambush, without strategy. The mist moved around them. Somewhere distant, a rook called from the trees. Everything that had begun in recklessness settled at last into choice. Their engagement altered after that. Society, which always prefers a simple tale, assumed the difficulties had been romantic nerves. Society was wrong. The true labor came afterward, in the daily work of making space for one another honestly. Arabella did not become easy, but she became, by degrees, more exact with herself. Once, weeks later, Euphemia found the dowager in the schoolroom speaking with Mrs. Finch about the winter linen fund. The apology she offered was private, insufficient to erase, and more real for lacking performance. Euphemia did not mistake it for sainthood. She recognized it instead as the difficult beginning of repair. Celestine made one final attempt at superiority during the wedding breakfast by observing that affection born in turbulence can fade quickly under responsibility. Euphemia, now Duchess of St. John, set down her cup and replied with serene sweetness, "Then I am fortunate, for ours was born not in turbulence, but in recognition. Turbulence merely introduced us." Dufton nearly smiled into his coffee. Married life did not erase their natures. He remained measured, grave, protective in ways that often looked like silence until one understood the force beneath it. She remained quick, vivid, and dangerously incapable of accepting nonsense merely because it wore tradition. But the shape of the house changed around them. Doors stood open longer. Music returned to rooms once preserved like museums. Estate decisions became conversations. Dufton learned that safety was not the absence of disruption, but the presence of trust. Euphemia learned that love need not swallow a woman if the man she loved had enough courage to make room. By the next spring, tenant wives came to the Duchess directly with petitions because they knew she would not confuse politeness with justice. Dufton, far from resenting this, quietly adjusted the estate office hours so she could sit in on the cases that involved widows, pensions, and school accounts. When a visiting cousin remarked that the new Duchess had made St. John House less formal, Arabella answered before anyone else could. "She has made it inhabited," the dowager said. It was as close to blessing as she had ever spoken. Years later, when people repeated the story of the Masquerade kiss, they embroidered it into comedy. They preferred the scandal to the truth beneath it. They said Euphemia trapped a duke with boldness. They said Dufton fell because a beautiful girl was daring in the moonlight. They said love began at the pond. Only the two of them understood that love had not begun there. At the pond, two frightened people merely collided with the truth. Love began later, when he listened without defending power, when she returned with evidence instead of silence, when he chose justice over inherited convenience, when she discovered that partnership with the right man did not feel like vanishing at all. The kiss had been reckless. The marriage was deliberate. And because it was deliberate, it endured.